Hello. Welcome back to Full Time with Meg Linehan. I am Tamerra Griffin, and I am joined by my co-host, Meg Linehan, who, along with Steph Young, educated me on Melissa Etheridge, who was just announced today as the national anthem singer for the NWSL Championship. Meg, thank you for your service. And how are you doing?
I mean, just as an elder gay, like, I feel like if you are at the geriatric scale of millennials, you know who Melissa Etheridge is. But it is, like, I mean, congrats to the NWSL for hitting both the KC market and the queer market. Like, you nailed it. Good job. I do think there are probably a lot of, like, 12 to 25-year-olds being like, we don't know who this is. But that's fine.
Yeah, and to be fair, once I was educated, I do know that come to my window.
Yeah, I think as soon as, like, that's why we were all just like, we put the song in the chat and you'll know who it is. Mm-hmm. It's just like you might not have the name and the song associated with each other. But it's fine. She's still touring. She's still going.
Wow, it's still touring too.
Yeah.
Love that for her. Well, speaking of NWSL Championship, that is going to be part of the theme of this episode because we are approaching the end of the regular season somehow. We've made it, you guys. Somehow we've made it.
Have we made it?
Yeah, that's true. There's still time. Still time for the chaos to jump on our shoulders and just wreak havoc. But even as we're going to be talking about what we can make of the seasons of the teams that are not going to be going to the playoffs, we are also going to be looking ahead to 2026 expansion, unpacking what that means, highlighting the cities that have put their bids in, and just sort of discussing the sort of philosophy of what it means to expand in the NWSL, things that we should be looking for. We'll also be sort of having a little bit of fun with it by describing our dream expansion teams, which I'm very excited about. I put considerable thought into it, and I'm sure you did too, Meg, but I'm excited to hear how you're imagining this. But before we get there, let's talk Summer Cup, because even though it feels like we were just discussing this, Summer Cup did happen last week. Kansas City Current beat New York Gotham FC 2-0, a brace from Temwa Chewinga, of course, no surprise there. Meg, this tournament sort of got swept under the rug. It was an Olympic year, lots of other things happening, but what should we be taking away from this?
I mean, it's also like you have the finale of Summer Cup in October, which remains one of the most baffling, dumb, in the middle of an international window. Like, it's just, okay. We have to set that aside, but it drives me absolutely up a tree. I do... Like, this is the thing about Summer Cup is, like, I can see where it came from. I can see how, you know, like, you look at MLS. Sorry. I just figured I would let that pass. You know, where did it come from as a concept, right? And I think MLS has tried to figure out how to put in extra competitions in the summer. You've got Leagues Cup now. You've got Mexico involvement. NWSL is kind of going, okay, like, as a concept, we like it. But then I think now with the first one, it's like, maybe okay idea. And then the execution just felt really weird, lackluster. Coverage, I felt like, was pretty non-existent the entire time. Like, I just didn't rate it as a competition. It was interesting to, like, think about, but it was not moving the needle, I think, in terms of coverage.
Yeah, it felt a bit underwhelming in a lot of ways. Like I said, it's hard to compete with an Olympic year. There were some interesting games. It was nice to see some players who maybe weren't getting as many minutes during the regular season have some time to play. But I do feel like this is yet another sort of experiment, whether we're talking expansion, where we have a lot of questions. But I do think that we need to bring in someone from the show who was actually there for the Summer Cup final, our show producer, Theo Lloyd-Hughes, who can sort of bring a little bit more balance to this discussion. So, Theo, please join us and add a little bit more to the discourse. First of all, can you set the scene for that final? Because it seems like there was some things we may have missed if we weren't there to experience it.
One, thanks for having me. Nice to be on this side of the glass.
Always.
It was very hot. I think that's probably the first thing. You know, Meg made the point that it wasn't in the summer. Well, deep in the heart of Texas, it's summer almost all year. So it was pushing nearly 90 degrees Fahrenheit at kickoff, and I would call it, you know, the summerest of summer cups. There was 3,500 people there. It is not the vibiest stadium you've ever been to. It feels very sort of American soccer, early 21st century, concrete, no roof, no frills. The media tent was a pop-up temporary tent. I think the players were in what looked like pop-up changing rooms too. I mean, they had to, have an add-on. I think maybe KC were in a proper changing room and the players were in a pop-up. The Gotham were in a pop-up one because of the extra staff they had or extra players they had. Both teams brought all their squads because it was a cup final. You didn't want any players left back in the city that they traveled from. So, it was sort of big on players, big on people, but not necessarily ready to host these top athletes, and it was a bit sparse in the crowd. And I think, what upset people as well is Commissioner Jessica Berman wasn't there. There were some Liga MX Femenil reps, but they were sort of a little bit second fiddle to other NWSL executives that handed out the trophy.
I do think it's worth bringing up, what did the Mexican teams in the league get out of this tournament? Because I think that is the sense of, I think they went going in okay, we can kind of start cracking the American market. I mean, we've seen that ambition from Tigres and Club America in particular. And then I don't know if that ambition was ever realized.
Absolutely. I think that's probably the biggest takeaways from a competitive angle. If you're the NWSL teams, you're thinking, how can I keep my lower roster players getting minutes? How can I stay busy, stay focused, stay competitive during the Olympic break? The Mexican teams, the season had already started by the time the Summer Cup did. So you've got big trips from Mexico City all the way to San Diego, thousands of miles, to try and squeeze in a game between their league matches. And none of the teams made it out of the group. Yes, maybe they were able to do a little bit of fan engagement here and there, but it did feel from a competitive angle, you were actually hurting Liga MX Femenil teams rather than the NWSL teams. And I think on the ground, the presence of Liga MX Femenil felt very minimal at the final. That being said, I did see probably as many Liga MX Femenil shirts or Liga MX shirts in the crowd as I did non-Kansas, non-Gotham NWSL shirts. So that maybe gives you an idea that Club America fans in San Antonio, Tigres fans in San Antonio did show up.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that, in some ways, that the final was featuring two NWSL teams, because there could have been a totally different atmosphere if even one Liga MX Femenil team had made it. But, at the end of the day, the Current did lift the trophy, Theo. And can you give a sense of what that energy was like? Because you would think that, 3,500 people in the stands, nothing particularly celebratory or flamboyant about this final, that winning there might feel a bit flat, but it sounds like that wasn't really the case.
Yes, I think when we take off our cynic's hat and you're walking around San Antonio for a day and you don't see a single thing that says Summer Cup final is being hosted by San Antonio. There's nothing at the airport, there's nothing in the city, there's nothing on the billboards. You almost think, what's going on here? Does anyone want this game to happen? And then you see the players, and the trophy looked fantastic. Give credit to the league for that. Prize money being 55,000, which is probably a fifth or a sixth of what the last year's Challenge Cup winners got in 2023, is not good for 5-6 extra games they played. But the trophy looked amazing, and seeing players like Temwa Chawinga, who, by the way, scored 2 fantastic goals and wowed anyone who did show up, the 3,500 people there. Seeing her lift the trophy on her head and start a conga line with her teammates is something I'll remember forever. And seeing Adi Franch with her daughter, with the confetti showering down, making confetti angels and just sort of lifting each other up. And even people like, assistant manager Freya Coombe, who has been an interesting figure in the NWSL, getting close to, the top thing that everyone wants to win, right? Trophies. These are things that everyone will remember. And there are a lot of people in that Kansas City team and staff who I think it was a really special night. And yes, the competition was flawed. Yes, the support was flawed. Yes, the prize money was flawed. The marketing behind the final was flawed. But for moments, there was joy.
Good balance. And in some regards, this conversation doesn't sound too different maybe than conversations we may have had a few years ago about the NWSL Shield and how much room for improvement there was there in terms of the prestige of it. I do get the sense that Summer Cup, if it continues, maybe this year was sort of just like the planting of the seeds. Lots to build on. Liga MX Femenil continues to develop, and hopefully if this tournament continues, the two teams that reach the final will be a little bit different, because I think that's where you get the joy. You know, that was sort of the point. But Theo, thank you as always for your thoughts. We appreciated that dispatch. Speaking though of international football news, we did have the Ballon d'Or ceremony recently. If you follow global football, you probably won't be surprised that Aitana Bonmatí was awarded now twice in a row. But there was a lot of presence of both U.S. women's national team and NWSL players. Sophia Smith came in 4th. Lindsay Horan came in 5th. Mal Swanson in 6th. Trinity Rodman in 9th. So that's the full triple espresso in the top 10. That's a pretty big deal. Barbara Banda in 12th. Alyssa Nair in 17th. And Tarciane in 23rd. Meg, one of the things that we sort of touched on even in the Summer Cup was timing, and Ballon d'Or also needs to be taken to task a bit for the way that they time this award, specifically when it comes to women's football. Still room to grow there, right?
Yeah, and I mean, Emma Hayes actually talked about this. I mean, we've seen these complaints happening a couple of times now in terms of like it's smack dab in the middle of an international window, right? And so I think that there is this kind of sense of, and we've seen this from this award in general, right? Women's football is an afterthought. And I think finally, like, they're starting to make improvements. There is the sense of this should hopefully change in the future, but at the same time, it's just like, this is why I get a little frustrated by this award, because I'm like, I understand why people are so fixated on it, and I understand why awards get talked about all the time, but like, you have to put them in the context of who's, like, just how we talk about these things. And so I do think until we see some, like, the fact that, you know, we don't have the same amount of awards on the women's side as the men's side, the timing, right? Like, all of these things need to get fixed, and then I'll feel, like, slightly more confident about really rating. I mean, but it just goes back to our discussion at the start. Like, Naomi Gurman not being on this list is still a major problem. So, like, it's really fun. Like, Alyssa Nair, 17th, I think is a really good and interesting sign of goalkeepers getting respect. I think the Olympics performance, her leading in, like, going back to Gold Cup and that performance she put in, right? Like, her finishing 17th is really good and cool. And I mean, maybe to steal Theo's expression, like, take off our cynic's hat, like, that's cool and fun and that's great. But at the same time, I'm just like, I don't know why I'm expected to care about this.
Yeah, it's a catch-22, because on the one hand, you need to be on the inside of these sort of institutions to sort of enact change. So I did think it was cool that the Athletics' very own Steph Young was able to cast a vote in the Ballon d'Or. On the other hand, it's frustrating when you are on the inside because you're that much closer to the lack of progress. So what can we do but move forward? Which we are going to do after this break. But before we go there, please continue reaching out to us. We appreciate every DM, every email, every message that you have with your thoughts about everything that's going on across the world of women's soccer. Fulltime at theathletic.com if you are the emailing sort, but also please make sure you're following us on social media at TA Fulltime. We love to hear from you. All right, Meg, expansion. We are approaching 16 teams in this league. There are 5 cities vying for that spot: Cleveland, Cincinnati, Denver, Nashville, and Philadelphia. Lots to consider. These are all very different markets.
Yep.
We have a final sort of 3 within that.
Yeah, I mean, everything that I've heard really does indicate that Denver and Philly are kind of maybe in their own tier, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, maybe not ruled out entirely, but there are 3, I guess, front runners, right? That question. So, but yeah, I mean, it's every single one of these is going to offer you something different and to go alongside with Boston in 2026.
Absolutely. So how do we sort of evaluate what it means to want to expand into the NWSL? There if you look at the past, 3-4 years, no two expansion teams have been alike. Extremely different approaches that we've discussed on this very show. But looking at these three, we'll say, what do you think people need to be keeping in mind in terms of who to be looking at, what sort of things we need to be hearing, flags potentially? There's a lot to unpack.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it is really interesting of thinking about both the expansion teams that have gotten in and then also maybe withdrawn bids. Like I think about Minnesota Aurora and that ownership group kind of continuously being like, can you look it up? Like, we'd probably be a really good market for the NWSL. And then and now the money is so different, right? So, like, yeah. I mean, at the very first level of analysis, you have to make that guess externally. Like, I think we should also need to preface, like, what the public knows about an expansion process is very different than what Inner Circle Sports, who is the investment banking whatever, who runs this like, they have so much more information across the board. We don't see the pitch decks. We don't see any of this stuff, right? And so it is kind of incumbent upon the potential expansion teams. I think Cleveland has been the most public-facing of the three kind of front-running bids to kind of say, like, hey, we've got some land, we've got this plan, let's open up the doors a little bit, the same way I think Bay FC did, right? The 4 former players, I think, really ran that PR front for Bay FC during the expansion process. But I think there is kind of this rubric that you can still, even if you might not have all the pieces, when people are thinking and trying to theorize, okay, who's team number 16 coming into the league? So money is obviously that first level, and it's just impossible to know who's got the deepest pockets. And it's not only like who can afford whatever the expansion fee is going to be for team number 16, but then who's got some extra millions of dollars to like invest into the team. So that's part one. Then I think it's always down to facilities. Like, are you going to have control of your own training facility, your own stadium? Like, what is the infrastructure around those two in terms of transportation and, not just for fans trying to get to a game, but also like players. Are you going to have spaces for players and all that kind of stuff? Then I think there's also now the sense of, do you know what you're doing in terms of like coming into hire staff, build a team in this new CBA / post-draft era, right? Like, are you going to be competent in running a team / hiring the right people to run a team? And then I think there's the final part of like, does the market make sense for the NWSL? And here, for this particular case for Team 16, I think there is going to be that sense of the Midwest has, like, we've done a whole bunch of West Coast expansion. Boston's coming in. So somewhere in the Midwest, not on a coast, feels like, they have that advantage coming in.
And one of the interesting, if sort of unexpected, litmus tests that I've discovered in the past couple of years is how these cities are sort of making their case through U.S. soccer, so to speak, and where the U.S. women's national team tends to play their games. I remember being in Nashville last year, and that was the first time I heard local reporters asking former U.S. women's national team head coach Vlatko Ananovsky what it was like to be in Nashville and what he thought of the facilities, and not really putting the pieces together at the time because I didn't know Nashville had thrown their name into the hat back then. But now I'm just like, oh, okay, this is their way of sort of laying the groundwork.
And also because a national team game, like, this is the challenge, though. It is a one-off thing. It's the national team. It's a known entity, but it doesn't
come around everyone.
Like, data, and also then this kind of launching pad of like, hey, U.S. Soccer almost always, I think, shares data with whatever local team or maybe incoming team is coming in, so that way you can say like, hey, we want to market and try to like bring these people into the women's soccer fold. But I think it's at least, it's going to give you some information. It's not going to give you all the information, but it is a helpful data point for markets trying to figure out, like, is there demand here?
Absolutely. And I think anytime you can have some like name recognition attached, I would imagine at least, maybe you can check me on this, it doesn't hurt. So when I think of ownership groups like Bay FC, like Angel City, that had easy name recognition in their ownership groups, whether it was ownership, GM, it doesn't hurt, right? But how much do you think that actually matters? Because it obviously, in the case, unfortunately, of Angel City, is not going to spell immediate success. But when it comes to marketing and reputation...
But for Angel City, I think it is immediate success on the business side, right? Like, Angel City is very much, and you look at the valuation right now, right?
Yeah.
And the sale to Willow Bay. Like, Angel City is successful in some places, just not necessarily on the field, which, again, we will get to later on in this very show.
Good point.
But there is this sense of, you know, now I think names being attached to ownership groups, but especially also, like, former players being attached to ownership groups, does give you some sort of advantage, and does give you, I mean, we just saw it with Boston announcing Elizabeth Banks and Allie Raisman. Like, it just gives you other entry points from your ownership group into potential fandom, into potential reach, potential marketing, whatever it is. So I think that has become part of the calculus of, like, are these just kind of like some rich people that we don't necessarily know about, right? Or is there a chance also to maybe figure out, like, can we get to, I mean, when you think about the potential sale of North Carolina Courage going through, Lauren Holiday has been tapped, right? Because there is a real knowledge there. And so like, celebrity is nice to have. Former players for me is the one where I'm like, that does, at least in my mind, if you've got the right former player involved who gets it and who has lived it, Lauren Holiday is a perfect example of that, right? Like,
can do no wrong.
NWSL 1.0 has been through it, has been involved continuously with the NWSL and now with the Impact Award. Like, that is a name that people respect in so many ways. So I think that is another part of the calculus or the matrix, whatever you want to call it.
And it seems that in the past couple of years, the bar is just getting higher, which I think is why we're not seeing any two bids, any two expansion teams who've enacted the same formula. And for me, that almost makes it even more challenging to imagine what these potential teams can do to sort of stand out from the rest. I mean, Sports Business Journal did report that NWSL Commissioner Jessica Berman visited Cleveland in October. The league visited Denver, which is not quite at the high tier, and Cincinnati in August. So there have been these little hints of where people might be looking, but remains to be seen. I do think, though, that it's worth discussing for people who might be looking at bigger cities like Philadelphia and thinking that this is an obvious choice.
I mean, Atlanta, right? Like, that's it's the same kind of argument of just because a market makes sense from like people live there, soccer does well there. I mean, like, we could now maybe debate like how Atlanta United has changed very drastically from the first couple years of its existence and how successful it is. Like, they're now a little bit of a struggle on the field. But there is this sense of, like, everybody has always looked at Atlanta of, like, women's soccer has been there before, right? Why are we not going back there? And that gives us a different market and a very cool market. And obviously now with U.S. soccer moving into the Atlanta area, like, there is such a natural fit for Atlanta. But there's no ownership group that is throwing their money where the desire is right at the moment. And so that is the struggle of, like, yes, there's a potential ownership group in Philadelphia, but just because the market maybe makes sense to us or was a previous market in a previous league, that doesn't give you some sort of advantage heading into this expansion process.
I think that's a really important point to note, because people who may not be following expansion news as closely, I think could understandably have questions about that. But I also want to talk about another way to expand into the NWSL that we haven't discussed yet, which is essentially by pushing your way in as a team from a different league. And I'm talking specifically about USL. It's not something that we've seen before. Meg, does it feel possible in the foreseeable future?
I mean, it's the closest that we've got, right, is Minnesota, again, trying to push their way in from USL, but that's not even Super League, right? Like, the challenge, too, is that Super League has been designated a Division I league, and NWSL is a Division I league. So I can't really see it happening, right? And then, but what if there is a Super League team that's very successful, and the NWSL goes, oh, that's a market that we want to be in? Like, I mean, I guess it's not like a closed door, but the chances of it feel so unlikely to me at this point, unless you have an ownership group that is actively thinking, okay, we started in Super League because we could afford it. Now we can figure out how do we afford NWSL. And I don't know if I see that happening outside of Minnesota, who I think have always had the sort of higher aspirations and obviously have been successful on the MLS side. Again, at least in terms of, establishing a team, maybe not in terms of performance, but it's just, that is such a strange and unknowable thing right now.
Yeah. And I mean, some of these teams are just going to need time to cook. I think to your point that if an ownership group wants to make it happen, it's going to have to be such a long game because, like we're saying, not only is the NWSL itself continuing to expand, the bar is rising. Yep. Yesterday's price is different from today's price, and race to the third power.
I mean, the good news is that, from the jump of Berman coming in, she's always been very we don't have a set number that we want to end at right now, right? Because I always feel like that's the discourse with MLS of oh, we're going to hit 30 teams and then we're done. Or oh, we're going to hit 26 teams and then the number just does actually keep growing. The limit does not. They do keep adding expansion teams. And we have not seen that conversation coming out of the NWSL front office in the same way. Now, the challenge is there is more competition from the Super League. 16 teams already feels like, again, we've seen the lack of parity this season, right? And so if you keep expanding once we get to 16 teams, what happens then in terms of quality and parity and all the things that parity is a superpower is the thing that we just hear on an endless loop coming out of that league front office. And if you expand to 16 to 18 to 20, can you hold on to that narrative forever?
Right. And if not, what does the new narrative become? Because it's already starting to feel like we're going to need to brainstorm them given what we're seeing in the season right now. Okay, so Cleveland, Cincinnati, Nashville, it's looking like, is there any one of those three, Meg, that you're feeling might have an edge over the other two?
I feel like Cincinnati might be in terms of power ranking, third right at the moment, maybe Nashville second. Part of it too is it's just so hard to know right now because again, Cleveland has been the most forward facing. So I think it is easiest to be well, Cleveland, they've got land, they've got the stadium concept, right? That's so important to the NWSL. You hear all this scuttlebutt coming out of teams oh, we heard Cleveland did pretty well in that presentation, right? But Nashville, I think, also feels pretty confident. Cincinnati, again, Cincinnati has been waiting for the Rose Lavelle homecoming for how long now, right? They have such an easy narrative to build around. So I don't know if there is going to be a clear answer before we actually get it from the league. And I don't know if there's a right answer or a wrong answer. I mean, I will say can't be in Cleveland's new stadium, but I've been in the new Cincinnati stadium. I've been in the new Nashville stadium. Both would be great, right? I don't know if there's a wrong answer at least.
Yeah, this is all very much an open-ended question. There's something sort of like Rorschach test about this because what you want to see in an expansion team, I think, says a lot about what you want to see in the league because expansion teams are an opportunity to introduce something new, which is a great segue to this little game I'd like to play, which is build your own expansion team. The Athletic actually has written a very fun piece that I recommend about this very topic that you can go.
We did a little goofing off in Slack one day.
It's very fun. It's unhinged in parts, but that's what makes it fun. So make sure you check that out. But for now, Meg, tell me, for your dream expansion team, where is it going to be based? Who is not necessarily the owner, because a lot of times it's just rich people whose names we won't recognize. But maybe you can say the owner too if you want. But specifically, who is going to be the celebrity owner, the person who sort of stands next to them and sits next to them at games? What's the name of your team? What are their colors? And who is going to be their first splashy signing?
Yeah. So what's fun is we came up with this game and then I immediately wanted to break it because I also, listen, let's say we're talking about Team 17, right? I'm immediately in favor of being actually, expansion should be killed for a while. We're not going to expand the league because we have to make sure all the teams are in the right place at the right, like, you've got to make sure that the teams who are in the, like, have-nots category, as we have kind of categorized them, can catch up. And so for me, my dream is actually Houston getting taken over, right? And getting kind of reborn, because I think we also have seen maybe a little bit of a trend of the separation of MLS and NWSL teams. It's working in Orlando, but we saw it in Portland, and I think there is maybe an opportunity here for someone to step into Houston and right the ship a little bit in a way that we have not ever seen. But for me, like, there is a chance here to maybe, because all of Houston's identity stuff has come out of the shared club with the Dynamo, right? Like the orange and all of that. So I think there is room for a new team name, a new color. Like, they don't have to move. And for me, my celebrity owner that I would love to see in the NWSL is Beyonce. Who
other than the
like
queen?
Natural fit. So I'd like to think that I'm still playing in the spirit of the game.
Yes.
But like,
absolutely.
I think there is this sense of, like, yes, expansion allows you to bring in something new, but I think that there is also very much a deep need for the NWSL to make sure that all of its teams are as strong as possible heading into the next round of expansion, so that way you don't get these bigger questions of, are teams going to fall behind, or are expansion teams going to come in and immediately struggle?
I like that. So you're keeping same colors, same name.
I mean, the orange is iconic.
It is.
For Houston. So it is a little tough, but I do kind of like how they have introduced that sort of Space City blue a little bit. So I think, like, playing with that, like, I do really enjoy when the Houston Dash lean into the NASA part of it all. And, like, obviously you can't, but, like, you know, we've seen the naming around Houston Comets, Houston Rockets, like, all that. So, like,
that's true.
I think there is some room here for Houston to be a little more playful, lean into that Space City. Like, I mean, Space City FC, honestly, wouldn't hate it.
Where's the merch?
Just saying.
I can see it. And there's a lot of fun you can have with that design-wise.
Just put Beyonce in a little astronaut outfit, we're good.
We already give our money, so much of our money to her anyway. Like, just an appearance at a game would.
Oh yeah.
Talk about skyrocketing.
Yep.
I like that. And I'm actually so glad that you chose this specifically with Beyonce as an owner, because my team has Rihanna as
perfect. There we go.
owner. So imagine the derby there. Yeah. Like, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. But when I was thinking about where I would want this team to expand, I wasn't necessarily thinking about it being the 17th team. But when I think about cities that have football, soccer culture already baked in, when I think about cities that would be sort of a shoo-in to host NWSL championships, various tournaments, I think of Miami. And part of the reason I wanted Rihanna to be the owner of this team is because you need someone with the star power that can possibly outshine that of Miami's current king.
Yes.
Rihanna is king, she's queen, she's just royalty. You know, she transcends all of that. And she's been to a few soccer games, you know, in Europe.
She did just have that soccer moms line, right? Like,
right. Exactly. You know, she has this deal with Puma. She's been designing shoes. Puma, of course, is a sponsor already for a lot of different teams. So I can see her being very interested in this. The team name that I came up with, because one thing about me, your girl loves an alliteration. So this team name is going to be the Miami Marauders FC. I actually was inspired also, for extra credit, to come up with the supporters group. Also an alliteration, the Rowdy Rodders.
Okay. Love it.
Colors, I'm pulling from, of course, you know, the white sandy beaches, the perfect blue waters of Miami Beach. So this team is going to be cerulean blue specifically, metallic gold, not just bright, you know, canary yellow, but gold, because we need to sparkle and shine, and black, just to kind of like bring everything down. I think metallic gold and black is really chic. And the first signing. Oh, I forgot to ask you about your signing.
First signing. I mean, to be fair, I have an existing team as my base, so it is a little tougher, but yeah.
This one I actually struggled with, and this was the first point in this sort of like imaginary expansion team brainstorming that I was like, okay, this is actually hard work. Because it's like, do you go with someone who sort of represents the club, i.e. maybe someone who's a Florida native, or do you go with someone who is going to help you win? Ideally, you can get both, but I think for this question, I sort of conflated it with who I would most like to come to the NWSL. And right now, and right now that's Tabitha Chewinga.
Okay, fair. Yeah, because that's where my brain started cycling again, and I was like, Kat Macario.
Ooh.
Get Kat Macario back over here, right? Like, I'm ready.
I love that. So yeah, the Miami Marauders coming to a league near you, and who knows when, but I believe in manifestation. So Rihanna, if you're listening to this, know that you have a home in the NWSL, and Beyonce too, for that matter.
Yeah, no, just like both of them. Just let's go.
Just let's go. It's time. Let's expand together, expand the empires.
I do feel also that this would be a good one for people to email/comment about, in terms of like, if you can have your dream. Again, it was a very fun exercise when we wrote that article of just like, what are some of the weirdest combos? Also, it's so telling that one of mine was bringing back the Boston Breakers, but with Amy Poehler. So I kind of did it. But
yeah, you're
really
on brand.
Yeah.
I like your revivalist approach. I think that that's really thoughtful, actually. And I know you and I have had conversations about what it means to both expand and take care of the teams who have been there from the start. So I see all of that showing up in your choices. I like it. When we get back, we are bringing ourselves back to the present, looking at the NWSL currently and the teams that sadly will not make it to the playoffs, but we need to give them their flowers. We need to have sort of a post-mortem review. So when we get back, we're going to be discussing Angel City FC, Utah Royals, Seattle Reign, San Diego Wave, and the Houston Dash in their current form, about what the sort of inflection points were for them this season and what we think they might need to be thinking about heading into next season to make it maybe a little bit more successful. All right, Meg, Angel City, yet again, another very topsy-turvy season. They are eliminated from playoff contention, but I think still warrants some discussion. Is there any specific thing that we can pinpoint about what may have gone wrong for them this season? This was a tricky one for me because it wasn't explicit.
I mean, I do think that we struggle to come up with something. I mean, like, there are definitely some good things that have been happening for Angel City, because Kristen Press coming back, scoring that goal, right? Like, the emotions of that. Alyssa Thompson popping off. But then, like, I mean, the sanctions from the NWSL front office are, like, too late in this. Like, yes, that kind of probably cemented them on their course to missing the playoffs, but I don't think that's a root cause of them missing the playoffs. Like, for me, it really is just still, I don't know what this team always wants to be on the field. For me, one of the things that I brought up was June Endo's injury and how I think that's had an impact on their season. So again, like, there have been bright spots, but Allie Riley too. Allie Riley getting hurt and in such a strange way.
Yeah.
So I don't, like, it's really hard to be like, there's some flaw, right? It's just like, they're just not at the level that they need to be at to make the playoffs right at the moment.
I agree. And there seems to be a critical gap between, you have players like Sydney Leroux, for example, who just signed a new 3-year contract extension.
Which is great. Like, good.
It's incredible.
Very good news for
and she's
Sid
like,
and for Angel City.
She's playing like she has another 5 years in her, you know? And of course, you have the Thompson sisters who have shown out this season. But what's been missing for me is sort of that in-between generation of, like, players who are maybe in their early 20s who are, and I'm not saying that these players are not on the team, of course they are, but I need them to sort of be a little bit more present in terms of the responsibilities maybe that they're being given. I was sort of disappointed to not see more of Messiah Bright, who had an incredible rookie season with the Orlando Pride and has, you know, been getting slightly more minutes toward the second half of the season. But for me, that was sort of the gap with Angel City. And of course, you know, the identity sort of the team in terms of their style of play, I think remains a question mark.
Yeah. I don't think it's changed drastically from last season, pre-Becky Tweed. Like, I don't know. It's going to be really interesting to see their next, how they approach next year.
Agreed. I mean, the nice thing is that they have invested in so many young players who are only going to continue to develop. Kennedy Fuller is literally stunting in the U17 Women's World Cup as we speak, basically. And she's going to continue to grow. Casey Fair, who we still have not seen much of for club, continues to perform well for country. So there is still a lot to sort of hinge your hopes on, Angel City fans, if you're listening. But we're still needing to see the consistency. And of course, that is one of the reasons why they will not be in the playoffs, but worth mentioning, as are the Utah Royals. Expansion year, of course, you have to manage your expectations with that, but very much a tale of like first and second half of the season with them.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the head coaching change did play a role, but for them, I mean, what I think people should be really encouraged by is not only the results in the second half of the season, but the summer transfer window and how they approach that. I feel like there were major changes. I mean, what is unfortunate is just extremely recent news on Wednesday that Chloe Lacasse had torn her ACL and MCL. So, like, that's not going to be what you see at the start of the season. But even still, that's a team that is getting results despite injuries with a really, like, the new head coach is a baby. So I think there is definitely a lot to be hopeful for in Utah, and that really is, like, if they had not been in such a hole from the first half of the season, I think we'd be looking at a playoff team right now.
I think so too. I mean, we were just talking about Angel City not having a super identifiable identity, but in the second half of the season, that's been crystallizing with Utah in ways that are clearly paying off. I thought that it was interesting to see them pivot from what seemed in the first half of the season and when they were drafting their team, of a commitment to, bringing in homegrown players, and then completely pivoting because they have like, so many international players now on their roster. Right. Yeah. And that seems to be part of maybe the answer for them. Utah is probably, out of the 5 teams that we're discussing right now, if there was a team that if I could allow them to have another half of a season, like take the second half of this current season and have another one, I think that we'd be having a very different, we probably wouldn't even be talking about them in 100%. This conversation because they'd probably be in the playoffs.
Well, now also they're going to get a whole off season to really think about and like game plan in a way that they have. I mean, they've been on the move, right, since the coaching change and trying to get things turned around. So I do think Utah, if you are a Utah fan, you're probably feeling pretty good about this offseason. It gives you another chance to think about the roster. It gives you another chance just to think about building in a way that I don't know was successful from the jump, and now in a post-draft world, they can go out and ID local talent, but I think what has worked for them generally is the fact that they brought in international players that have been really, really successful for them. So, I don't know, exciting. Like, Utah is the one where I'm like, okay, great. Like,
let's go.
I'm ready for 2025.
Keep it going. Keep it going. Yeah. Speaking of off seasons, though, they have not been great to all teams. And when it comes to Seattle Reign, I'm not even talking about summer transfer windows. I'm talking about last offseason before this one started, because that is when the blows came, and unfortunately, they were not really able to recover from them.
Yeah,
a lot of losses.
I do feel like Seattle was doomed in a lot of ways. That ownership change, I think, really just put them in a holding pattern. And it's no fault to Laura Harvey or Leslie Gallimore in terms of like what they were able to do. But like Gotham can swoop in and grab Emily Sonnet and Rose Lavelle because they can make this pitch of like, hey, we've got these resources. We'll do this for you, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And Seattle did not have that sense of here's what's next. So I will say, like, good news for Seattle is the fact that we are talking about Seattle Reign FC. The sale is complete. The queen is back. The badge is back, right? Like, and they have started signing some younger talent. But for me, I mean, I do think one of the questions that we're going to be looking for this offseason is if Laura Harvey is maybe considering moving on from Seattle. I mean, she is that team in a lot of ways. And I'm starting to think, like, is it going to be better for everyone if Laura goes out and has him, thinks about like what she wants to achieve coaching, just because it feels like it's run its course a bit in Seattle at this point.
Yeah, there hasn't been a lot of change, unfortunately. Of course, they did make it to the NWSL championships last season, had an unfortunate result that went to Gotham. But I can imagine the difficulty of making that decision with someone who has literally been there from the start. And it's almost like as things continue to move forward, you're signing more younger players.
Yeah.
There's a part of you that wants to hold on to some semblance of the past that much more. But at some point, you have to start asking the hard questions if you want to grow. So I think that's a really pertinent one.
And I think for more Seattle talk, like we had Leslie Gallimore on the show previously, so I do think it's worth going back and listening to her point of view in terms of like what she was able to do, what the thought process is in terms of rebuilding this team. But it was a rebuilding year no matter what. I mean, you lose a club legend like Megan Rapinoe, who was retiring before she tore her Achilles in the championship, right? Like there was always going to be this sense of change. And, you know, Jess Fishlock and Lauren Barnes are still there, but I do feel like we're going to see at some point that transition happen as well. And so then I do think there are these bigger questions of just, like, I don't think Laura Harvey is a bad coach. It's just like sometimes I think things do run their course.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a matter of fit.
Yeah.
Speaking also, these teams, the segues are almost just writing themselves for me.
We're not doing it intentionally.
Because the Wave had it.
Yeah.
They had a fantastic coach in Casey Stoney. They had a committed coach. They had a successful coach and a successful team from the moment they expanded. But they let her go. And everything exploded and imploded after that. And it has been so hard for me to watch because it did not need, I mean, as far as we know, right? It did not need to go down like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is going to be one of the mysteries of the season, right? It's just like what exactly the thought process was in the Casey Stoney decision. But then obviously you've got all of the stuff off the field with Jill Ellis that I think has been kind of, it's informed, at least I'll put it that way. Like it is, I don't want to say like poisoning everything, but like it's inescapable when you talk about this team right at the moment.
Yeah.
And GM change there as well. And so Alex Morgan suddenly retires mid-season because she's gotten pregnant. And there's just all of these things kind of happening that feel like they're just pulling away from what the team is capable of. And again, like you've got one of the best defenders in the world in Naomi Girma. I think you got a world-class goalkeeper in Kaylin Sheridan.
Absolutely.
And
it just doesn't match up. For me,
the turning point, it's the Casey Stoney decision, because then after that, it's just like everything just kept getting weirder and worse and weirder and worse. And
you got Landon Donovan sitting on the grass in the middle of games, like.
And like I don't even, again, if Landon Donovan was the idea in terms of a short-term thing, like, again, I think he's a complicated person to pick, but I can understand the thought process of like he's there, he's got the tie to the community, whatever it is, right? And I think like every time I've ever been in a press conference with him, like I fully believe he's acting totally like to the best of his abilities, right?
Good faith, yeah.
But at the same time, he's not going to get that job, right? Like, and I think he knew going, like, if we get the results, great. If we don't, okay, no hard feelings, I'm out. So the path is clear on that front, but there's so much stuff that is so deeply unsettling about what is happening in San Diego that to think about the 2025 on the field stuff is just like, I don't know what this team's going to look like because I don't know.
It's hard to imagine anyone wanting to stick around for that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and the thing is, the Wave, yes, they had struggled in the beginning of the season, even when Casey Stoney was still there, but they could have still pushed for the playoffs at the time that they let her go. And then things went even further south, and now there's not even a question.
It's just like the weirdest sliding doors concept that you could ever have. Like, what happens if Casey Stoney stays? I don't know.
And what are players like Naomi Girma thinking, who, like, they got things to do? Jaden Shaw, I mean, these, like, young talents who need to be peaking right now and planting the seeds for the rest of their career. Really, this is probably the most tragic story, I think, because it completely came out of nowhere and felt so forced and unnecessary. Really feel for the players. Houston Dash, the saga, the team that you see yourself potentially reviving in this dream expansion scenario. Hired Fran Alonso in the offseason. His departure from the league is one of the most unique I've seen.
Yeah. Yep.
But that wasn't even the real like crux of their craziness, because of course with the Dash, a lot of issues had been present even before he came.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we started talking about Seattle, it was like doomed from the start of the season. With Houston, it's like doomed from 20
a while.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know, it just feels like the Houston Dash continue to have problems, right? And just like the way that they have turnover, the Maria Sanchez departure, right? How that played out, CeCe Kaiser departing, how that played out, like they keep stepping on rakes.
Yeah.
Every chance they get. And so this is one where I'm just like, I mean, I think we're expecting to see announcements coming out of Houston, but how would you ever have faith that any future announcement is going to be the right thing for that team?
Yeah.
This one is just depressing, honestly, I think.
It is. And I was just about to say that it's been apparent, especially in the earlier part of the season, and even the body language of the players, that you just got the sense that they were just hanging on, like just trying to get to the next day. And that is not something you want to see ever. Because that tells you that if you are having to put in that much work to sort of just mask the chaos that's like bubbling underneath, things are crazy. And I don't even know sort of like what to suggest for this team at this point. There are so many things that they need to be working on. But the thing is, on an individual level, the players they're bringing things that can still spell success, but they need to be supported.
Yeah. I mean, I do think one of the better turning points, too, is Paige Nielsen coming in,
yes,
who is that kind of like NWSL presence, right? Who has signed on, Jane Campbell being there, right? Like, I do think that you have some players that are obviously being built around, and that is hopeful. But I think they really, like, Houston has to get some pieces in place in order to, like, when you think about the challenge of the NWSL is to attract and retain talent. If you're a player trying to figure out what team you want to land at, whether that's via free agency, whether you're an international player, or whether you're a player coming out of college, Houston's going to have a real tough time in this offseason if they do not get building blocks in place quickly and that are actually correct decisions.
Absolutely. And this sort of goes back to that parity conversation that we've been having. And this is, to me, sort of the other side of it. And I guess the sort of like general arguments in favor of capitalism is the competition, right? When you see other people making the right decisions for their club, because one decision for one club isn't necessarily the right decision for another club. But when you have success, it is going to inevitably raise the bar. And it asks the same question of everyone. Are you going to raise the bar, or are you going to risk sliding even further down, because the hill is just getting steeper? And that's sort of what we're seeing with parity.
Yeah. And I mean, what is really interesting about all five of these teams right at the moment too is that there is a theme, I think, that goes across all of them, and that's change in some form. And whether that's ownership, right, which I think has impacted teams, obviously Seattle the most, but Angel City also went through an ownership change this year. Utah, head coaching change. Wave, obviously, a head coaching change. Houston, head coaching change. There have been GM changes as well. And so I think there is that element where, yes, we have seen teams be successful navigating changes, but I think we see teams be successful in that way. I mean, I think Portland is a good example of like a team that we could have been talking about in this section had they not managed to right the ship at the
They've had a triple threat of front office changes.
Exactly. And so this is, I think, one of these bigger storylines to watch moving forward heading into 2025, and especially with expansion coming in, right? Like, we're just going to keep seeing big changes like this. And who ends up, like, navigating those well and who doesn't.
Absolutely. So, as we bid adieu to Angel City, Utah, Seattle, San Diego, and Houston, we need to remain present because we are still in the season and need to preview this final regular season weekend, the season finale of the NWSL, which we're going to get to right after this break. Last regular season weekend, Meg, we've mourned on this show Decision Day. However, because of this shift in parity, it's not going to be totally necessary because
yeah, that's true. That is true. I mean, decision day is still, it's just like a fun, I mean, I don't know if I loved watching every game all of the time, but that was not my favorite part of decision day.
My eyes were definitely in need of a screen break by the end of it.
I mean, what is unfortunate is obviously we're waiting to see like the 7, 8, 9 and who ends up where. So the Portland, Bay, Louisville trio. Mm-hmm. And what I think is kind of unfortunate about this no decision day is that Louisville might know that it doesn't actually have anything to play for by the time they're the last game of the weekend. And if if Portland and Bay win, it's done. And so that's the part where I'm like, I wish, like, there's a real chance Sunday doesn't matter, and I don't love that.
I know. Especially in a league like this where, yes, we have seen a little bit more stratification, but no game is guaranteed. I mean, I'm looking at Friday's game, Portland and Angel City, and if you're listening to this and followed Decision Day last season, you remember that when the Thorns and Angel City played in Los Angeles.
Ooh, that was fun.
I mean, I'm a very goosebump-prone person, if you haven't gathered by now, but just thinking about that Sydney Leroux bicycle kick still does things to me from that game. Yeah. But all to say, this game could really go either way. So
it could. I would think the other thing that people should be watching for in this last weekend is Alex Morgan is getting that sort of retirement send-off game for real from San Diego, but the moment of the weekend is also going to be that Friday night game in Portland with the farewell for Christine Sinclair. Steph Young will actually be there. I'm sure she'll be checking in with us on the review show for early next week. But I think that is such a big, important moment, not just from a game point of view, but from Christine Sinclair is one of the originals of this league. She is Portland Thorns, like in every sense of the word. And so that for me is truly the moment of the weekend. And I am kind of glad that it gets its own moment to breathe.
Absolutely. Lot on the line, but lots to pay attention to as well. Last week's episode was all about the changing of the guard, passing of the baton, and ceremonies around the departures of veterans and GOATs who we will continue talking about long after they've stepped off the field, like Christine Sinclair, are a perfect encapsulation of that. So absolutely agree that is a cannot miss. Saturday, though, we got another meeting between Bay FC and Houston Dash. This particular matchup hits me in the feels a bit because this was the pairing that opened Bay FC's home season and ended with a very unfortunate stoppage time loss. I remember Diana Ordonez running into the crowd, like taunting them. It had all of the things. And of course, Bay needs some sort of point from this one in order to move on. So huge matchup. Coming off of course, an international break, which always makes things to me feel a little bit spicy because some people were away for international duty. The team hasn't been together much. Dash, as we mentioned in the last segment, of course, are out of the playoffs, but they are also like the exact team that would go out to a game like this with the sole goal of like ruining dreams.
So 100%. And sometimes spite really does work as a motivator, as we all know and love. Like, teams do sometimes really enjoy being playoff ruiners for other teams. And I can absolutely see that for Houston and Bay in particular, of like, oh, you think you're better than me?
Between it being Halloween weekend, between it being Scorpio season, like the stars are literally aligned for that kind of behavior. I'm prepared for it, I think. But of course, I'm a Bay Area native, so I have to hope that Bay gets the result there. And Meg, as you mentioned, that the result of both of those games will determine how much we need to be really following the Louisville Wave game. Of course, we will either way. But as you mentioned also, that is where we will see Alex Morgan's official goodbye ceremony. Still lots to pay attention to. I mean, the Wave have been an unfortunate story this season, but Louisville still have so much to play for. We had a conversation with midfielder Taylor Flint a few episodes back that I think is really worth listening to because she delves into the transformation that this team has undergone, what it's been like for her. And actually, that's sort of poetic, speaking of Taylor Flint, because she literally left the Wave to join Louisville and now has a chance, potentially, to clinch a playoff spot if they're able to get the result and, you know, stars align for them too. So lots of poetry sort of in this season finale of games.
And then it's playoffs.
Even though so many of these spots have been decided, once it really is going to feel like a new season in the sort of like drama entertainment sense,
just
because
chaos for November.
Everything's going to be rewritten, slate wiped clean, and anything can happen. And that's what I'm here for. So make sure that you stick with us for all of that. Make sure that you're listening to Full-Time Review because there are a few more international games, U.S. Women's National Team, under 17s and the senior team that we'll be going over on Monday for you. Of course, please also sign up for our free newsletter because there will be writings about all of these things as well. theathletic.com/fulltime. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Tamerra Griffin. I'm alongside Meg Linehan, and you've been listening to Full Time with Meg Linehan. You can catch me somewhere in the world trying to gather myself and probably making a vision board for this Miami Marauders team now that I think about it. Maybe I'll share it on Twitter and Instagram. Make sure you give me a follow.
That's perfect. I'm Meg. Thanks for listening to the end. Again, if you want to come up with your fantasy NWSL team, hit us up. We're ready. We're ready for it.
Full Time does not happen without podcast producer Theo Lloyd-Hughes, video producer Leah Griffin, and executive producer Emily Olson. Like I said, we'll be back in your podcast feeds on Monday with Full Time Review, and then, of course, again on Thursday with the next edition of Full Time with Meg Linehan. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.